I was forgotten. I've been put in a one-bedroom hotel room. Me, my wife, and my 3 kids. My wife was in intensive care for 3 weeks. My 2 children were in intensive care for 12 days. My 3-year-old came out early. She came out 4 days. So I had my 3-year-old. So they gave me a room for me and my 3-year-old. I was forgotten about. Until now, it's me, my wife, and my 3 kids, and we still have 1 bedroom, a double bed for 5 of us
in the hotel for 5 weeks. My daughter's at the stage now where she's learning to walk, learning to crawl, learning to talk. But what can she do? She can't do any of those things because she don't have a home. And you guys ain't offering that to us. You know, all this housing assessment, I'm sorry, it's just a waste of time. We need quality homes. You guys promised us that, what, 2 weeks ago? You guys failed.
The truth of the matter is, not you, no one done nothing for us. You know who done something for us? The residents of North Kensington, our community, our neighbours, our families. They done for us. They done for us.
I don't like the media. I don't like to bring attention to myself. I work. I'm a hard worker, just like all these other people. They work. You know, we live in Grenfell Tower. We built that area ourselves. Not you guys.
Many inquiries are taking place into how this happened. The actions of the TNO.
Welcome to The Fix. It's Thursday the 20th of July. I'm delighted to be joined for the first time ever on The Fix. But have you been on Novara before?
I have been on Novara before, yes.
On the radio?
Yes, and on some videos and stuff, and interviewed and written for you guys.
Oh yeah, you did that interview, like the Keep Corbyn.
I did.
It was a while ago, though.
Yeah, and I also, Erin and I were talking during a Cameron protest. Remember, like in a whole different age it feels now.
A Cameron protest?
Yeah, it was like those the pen about papers. This is before.
That was before my time, Joanna. Anyway, we started the show today with those scenes from a council meeting in Kensington and Chelsea. We're not actually going to talk about Grenfell today. We talked about that a lot on Monday with Dawn Foster. I highly recommend that conversation if you weren't watching it. We just wanted to point that out because, again, have a look at Dawn Foster's Twitter. There was some really moving testimony from that council meeting, and I think it's incredibly important that that gets as much attention as possible, basically. But today what we're going to talk about is the world. We've been a little bit parochial on The Fix so far. When we've talked about electoral politics, it's tended to have been fairly British, especially since the Corbyn phenomenon started. Today we're going worldwide. Before coming back to talk about, what's the word for BBC? Auntie
Beeb.
Auntie Beeb. Tom, what do they call it?
Auntie or Beeb, yeah.
Auntie or Beeb. We're going to talk about Auntie with Tom Mill, who's behind the camera as we speak.
So exciting.
Where are we going first, Joanna?
Well, I think one of the things that we haven't really talked a lot on Novara so far is the big craze around Emmanuel Macron, French new president. And today he's been on the news not for holding Donald Trump's hand, although we'll talk about that in a minute. I think it should be mentioned.
Well, Donald Trump's been on the news for holding Macron's
hand. Something like that.
Sorry.
Donald Trump's allegedly very small hands being held are our topic. But before that, I think, I don't know if you guys have even mentioned it here so far, but the fact that in the rest of Europe, there's been some sort of craze around Macron, particularly from the sort of centre-left in other countries, about this man who is supposedly the big saviour of social democracy, and of course it's absolute bollocks.
We have had that in Britain, I think, just from quite a small subset of
Yeah.
of the political establishment.
Well, we have this.
I mean, that would be a progress Fabian.
Exactly. I mean, since Corbyn, we thankfully have a social democracy that's a bit fresher, a bit more exciting than what we have across the rest of Europe. But as elections come and go, and there are quite a few coming up, I mean, Germany being a quite big one coming up soon, the rest of Europe is gearing up for action, and certainly some people are trying to make alliances with Macron and his party. Originally En Marche, now République En Marche, I think. Very sort of
Did
French.
they join with Republique? Not the Republicans.
No. They just call it that now, that it's sort of a party rather than just his own little pet project, I guess. But I think today it hit the papers and the news because not everyone is in favor of Macron, thankfully. And if by any chance any of the viewers think that this man has some sort of hope because he is the antithesis supposedly to Marine Le Pen, just think again that this man is the worst neoliberal I've probably seen in a while in the European political spectrum, if we're thinking outside of horrendous far right. So, so far what we've seen is a polarization of far right to kind of far left. Questionable how far left we are going, but regardless. And Macron is supposedly the sort of center, nice Obama type, Trudeau type kind of guy. He's definitely not. He's certainly leaning very much towards the center right in France.
So what we were told with Macron was that he would be economically somewhat conservative. So he'd be implementing austerity. He was quite open about that, and that has been his priorities at the beginning of his legislative difficult word agenda, which has made him a lot of enemies already. In the military was one who's quite upset about getting cut.
Interestingly enough, yeah.
I think the police as well, and
The
public
unions.
sector, the union. Everyone's upset because their wages are going to get cut by austerity, which hasn't really been proven to be successful many places so far. But one hope people did seem to have with Macron was at least he wasn't a racist. He was
exactly.
opposed to Marine Le Pen. At least he wasn't going to close off France to the world, and we wouldn't have a Trump in Europe, in one of the biggest countries in Europe.
The media are lapping this up,
But you were going to talk specifically about migration, right? So that liberal side of Macron isn't as liberal as it was made out to be.
Exactly, because as soon as he got into power, he met up, or soon after, he met with the Prime Minister or acting Prime Minister of Italy, saying that, clearly, I think his words were, we haven't really listened enough to Italy's cry for help on the migrant crisis, and we have to help them. And today, actually, the Deputy Foreign Secretary of Italy Mario Giro, has already come out and complained that nothing much has changed. And in fact, we're coming up to the summer. I think we have to contextualize this, right? This is the period in which most people will attempt to cross the Mediterranean. A hell of a lot of people are going to basically put their lives at risk and possibly lose their lives in the process. And we have a France that actually has not changed their policies on this. British, but also the rest of Europe has sent media to the the town of Ventimiglia in Italy, which is sort of a border town, where there are checkpoints, and France is basically just sending everyone back that they can. We hear reports about Calais, in which the situation really hasn't changed. If anything, it has become far more severe and far more hostile towards anyone who isn't, French. And so it really puts a question mark on how reformist and incredibly progressive, I guess is the word, Macron really is. Just to give an example of the policies before him that certainly haven't really been changed so far. French vessels that rescue people in the Mediterranean are not allowed to port in French ports. They have to take these people either back to North Africa more often than not, or somewhere else. So that's a sort of kind of Europe we're living right now. And if this is progress, then I am...
What are you?
Supermodel? Or
Oh, you could be a supermodel, Joanna. That's freaking something that you're less. Come on.
Okay, Santa. I'm Santa.
Yeah, that's good.
Easter Bunny. Then I'm the Easter Bunny.
Yeah, you're not the Easter Bunny. We can't argue with that.
Not.
So the context of that is that it's something that we probably that doesn't hit British politics quite as much as it does on the actual continent. So Britain, the politics of migration, it's very controversial, is people from Eastern Europe or other European countries coming to Britain. In most of Europe, the controversy is based on who's going to take in or who's going to take responsibility for people coming over from North Africa or the Middle East. fleeing war or fleeing poverty. And Italy and Greece, that's where people tend to land, and this is quite a big strain on their political systems. And they've been asking for other European countries to take some of the burden. Not, well, the burden, I shouldn't say the burden, but in terms of political stability, that is one thing it is. And they had an agreement in 2015, I think, about a quota where different European countries would take a certain amount of the people trying to come to Europe. Macron sort of suggested that France would be taking on more responsibility and has done very little.
Very little.
Nothing,
certainly
basically.
by the opinion of his neighbours, in this case Italy today, but surely it will come about that Germany will complain in some form or shape or form. They have done very little, if anything at all. I mean, it should be said that in Britain this sort of rhetoric is used over and time again if it's useful to our political elites. I mean, obviously we remember David Cameron using all sorts of pejorative terminology about people in Calais, which is sort of our closest port. It always comes about proximity, and it's so hypocritical. And we haven't really seen it because Calais, the refugee camp, has been destroyed, really, and there hasn't really been a question here. But just you wait, and let's see. I mean, the Dubs Amendment, if, for people who don't know, it's this proviso in government in which Britain has pledged to welcome migrant underage children, or children, to refugees to come into Britain if they have family here.
And we still haven't fulfilled that, right?
0 this year. 0 people or 0 children ever brought into Britain under the Dubs Agreement this year, and we're already by halfway down the year.
Yeah, I'll just the reason it's less controversial or less of a live political issue here isn't because we're more progressive about it. It's just because we're not part of Schengen, which is freedom of movement between countries without passport controls, which is why it becomes more political in Europe, because you can actually see people blocking people from crossing borders.
I think it's also because we have other foreign, sort of affairs going on right now. Something starting by B-R-E-X-I-T.
Brexit. Macron has been welcoming some people to France, namely Trump and his entourage. We're going to go to a nice little video of them at Bastille Day now. So in a way, it's lucky that Trump invited Macron for that visit, because it gave us a great segue to move from talking about Macron to talking about Trump. Some of the videos from that visit were fabulous. And actually that video you just watched is the one time where I actually feel like I kind of relate to Trump, because he wasn't enjoying that. Who was that song we were talking about this before? I'm off all night to get lucky. Daft Punk. He wasn't enjoying the brass band version of Daft Punk. I'm not sure I would have done either.
Mind you, he waxed lyrical about it in the New York Times today. You sent me that article.
Yeah.
It was, I mean...
Just because I sent an article doesn't mean I read it, Joanne. I probably sent it because I wanted you to read it.
Well, I have that bit. I mean, he did... The way he described that, in spite, I guess, of that sort of resting bitch phrase that he did, he was loving it. Well, at least that's what he tells the journalist. He was like, this is the best thing since cream cheese, and he wants it to be done in... I mean, the last thing that America needs right now is more nationalistic parade, or nationalistic parades at all, to be honest. But sure. But yeah, it was brilliant scenes.
So this was a very long interview in the New York Times. I say very long. I mean, I didn't manage to read it all, but there's some choice moments in it where Trump repeats about 3 times that Macron's a great guy and he really likes holding his hand. He really likes holding my hand, which, you know, it's just, it was quite sweet. Maybe it was sweet. God, I can't stop relating to Trump right now. I don't really relate to Trump. That's very disconnected from what I'm about to say.
It's either that or I don't know what we can do, but anyway, go on.
Yeah, so what I was going to talk about is the consequences of Trump. I think we talked about Trump a lot on Novara when he was first elected. And speculated a lot about what a Trump presidency might mean. And I feel like we haven't really followed up. So thinking about the effects of what Trump has been, our main worry was that he was going to start World War III, that he was going to nuke somewhere. It's only been 6 months. We've got no idea if he's going to nuke anyone in the next 3.5 years. What he has done is dramatically increased the casualties of American warfare. So this is an article in the Daily Beast, and the information was from Air Wars. So it's estimated that in coalition strikes in Syria and Iraq, so that would be in the war against ISIS, under Obama there were 80 civilians killed each month. Under Trump that's gone up to 360 civilians killed per month. So that's a really dramatic increase. And that is generally thought to be because Trump has basically given the military much more leeway to do whatever they want to do. So Obama, as much as he didn't really roll back or challenge American imperialism, he did have a tendency to sort of like want to know what the military were doing and to be quite restrictive of them. So to say, these are the protocols for when you can bomb, these are the protocols for when you can't, because he understood that civilian casualties would be detrimental to America's foreign policy, or his image, but also their objectives in Iraq and Syria. And he probably also wasn't as much of an evil cunt as Trump. Whereas Trump's basically saying, do what you need to do. And this has dramatically, as you can imagine, increased the civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria. This article is worth reading, and there was sort of like quite a tragic quote from someone from Human Rights Watch there, which was, "Remarkably, when I interview families at camps who have just fled the fighting, the first thing they complain about is not the 3 horrific years they spent under ISIS or the last months of no food or clean water, but the American airstrikes. Many told me they survived such hardship and almost made it out with the families, only to lose all their loved ones in a strike before they had time to flee." So that's people in ISIS-held territory who have, I suppose you have to keep your head down to survive for a couple of years in ISIS-held territory, and they felt like finally there was going to be an opportunity to get out, and then an American bomb drops and their family become collateral damage in the fight against ISIS. So in terms of foreign policy, it's not looking good. Although it's potentially not looking good in the sense that Trump is giving over authority to the military, not that he necessarily has much agency.
Yeah, but I think it pinpoints once again, I mean, I know that America, particularly American governments, go very much from one pole to the other, but it really shows a return to hard power. You know, we had the soft power of Obama, diplomatic core all year round, schmoozing, and now we're looking at Donald Trump, and it's back to the guns. The difference between Donald Trump, I guess, and George W. Bush is that with Bush, he felt that he was sort of head of the military, he was the leader of the campaign, and Trump, being a businessman, is more than happy to sort of outsource the murdering to the military, to the American military itself.
Well, I mean, George W. Bush, as much as he seemed like an idiot, wasn't an idiot. So I mean, he did some awful things, but he had agency, and he sort of seemed to understand to some degree how the military works. And whereas
also
Trump
had ideology behind it, you know, like Trump, for all his things, I mean, he has an ideology he latched onto now. Yeah. God knows what kind of ideology he'll latch onto tomorrow, really, because up until a couple of years ago, he was supporting the Democrats through and through, or throwing money onto certain senators. So, I mean, namely the Clintons. So.
So on an international level, Trump seems to be giving free rein to the military, and the military know what they're doing and are happy to bomb people. On a domestic level, legislation and getting through his legislative agenda is proving more difficult, basically because it's all a bit too complicated for him and he doesn't like detail. So if you live in the Middle East, the Trump presidency is almost as bad as you expected. If you live in America, you can, in a way, be thankful that he's terrible at passing laws. So his plan to repeal healthcare is completely fallen flat, and that's basically because he hasn't managed to build any kind of coalition behind it. Once the Democratic Party is staying solidly behind Obamacare with all its flaws.
Who'd have thought?
Yeah, well, and the reason is Trump can't get any support behind Obamacare, behind repealing Obamacare, because there's lots of governors around the USA who don't want to get voted out when they remove the entitlements of a bunch of their citizens. I'm just going to finish on, because this is my particular interest, is the sort of democratic strategy in response to Trump's presidency, and I think it has a lot of correlations in Britain. So the Democrats don't seem to have learnt much from Hillary Clinton's loss. This is another article that will probably come up on screen, which is, one second. It's an, I've got article in the NY Times by, and then I obviously didn't type who it was by. But anyway, it's going to come up on the screen. And this is the idea that, that the Democrats in America, their strategy has been to focus on exactly the same kind of voters they were focusing on in the presidential election, which was basically white swing voters. And they're trying to win them over by focusing on Trump's failure to be nationalist, basically by having too much involvement with Russia, which I don't think anyone's going to care about. What they're focusing on is the fact that his son got some information from someone who said, well, he didn't get some, he was offered information on Hillary Clinton from a British music producer who said he could get dirt from the Russian government because the Russian government backed Trump. Trump's son said, sick, great, this is all in an email which he then tweeted out, which the Democrats thought was a smoking gun. And if you look at the American newspapers or American cable stations, this is what everything's about. This is all the Democrats are talking about. And I don't think it's going to land because basically people think, well, if you were going to get dirt on your competitor, why wouldn't you get dirt on your competitor?
And beyond that, I mean, the reason I think, once again, and this is the failure of the Democrats really, of realizing that people did not vote for Trump because of his potential. I mean, if they were really that worried about how pure this man was, they would have gone by all the crooked details he allegedly has with a bunch of pretty much mafia in the States itself. So who cares how many meetings, deals he's had done or hasn't done with Putin or any other smaller officials. What really matters to them is this promise he has of making America great again, right? Bringing them jobs, bringing them wealth, the American dream, you know, fly the flag, and so on. So who cares when you're hungry, when you're struggling to make ends meet? Who gives a if your president really talked to some Russian or not? I mean, it's not that, you know, it's not Cold War anymore.
I totally agree, because it seems like bad losers. It's like liberals saying he didn't play by the rules, but no one cares if you didn't play by the rules when you were fighting Hillary Clinton. They care if he's going to make their life less miserable, which he's not going to make their life less miserable, but focus on that. Don't focus on the fact that you feel hard done by because someone broke the rules.
In fact, I like the analogy of, you know, obeying by the rules, because it is exactly because people no longer believe that the rules are actually applicable or play a role at all that they voted for Trump in the first place. So who would care if all of a sudden, you know, Democrats come around and go, oh, he's not, you know, it's like a childish, like 3-year-old thing to say, like, oh, look at him, he also broke the plate or whatever.
We're going back to Britain. We're going to get Tom Mills on to talk about BBC Pay. Joanna, you're going to introduce the video because you found it, you sourced it.
Right, so well, not we, but turns out Chris Evans, this is like a shock, I was shook by this, right? Like Chris Evans, who in my personal opinion is not very good at what he does, regardless of what he's doing, is the highest paid member of staff in the BBC. I mean, it's 2.2 million the man gets paid a year. I mean, that is ridiculous under austerity Britain. Anyway, and
I didn't mind TFI Friday.
Oh God!
Every time I say that, people really make a face. But if you go on YouTube, you do best of TFI Friday. I actually thought that was quite a funny moment in TV.
I resent people who think they're funny when they're not. I think, and this is probably why. But you know, like in this particular case, it applies. The man, in my opinion, maybe I'm not sensitive enough to like British humor. Well, anyway, like the man gets obviously recently hired and quickly fired out of Top Gear. That's what news was. You know, headlines recently about Chris Evans, and in one of the shows, he clearly was not the best cast they could have done. And I think that's
don't give away the ending.
No. Okay. I'll just watch it.
Stop! Stop, please stop!
I'll go here. Tom, you go here.
Oh, go out!
Why is it red?
Strawberries.
Strawberry.
For breakfast.
Over the last 10 years, things have really changed.
Victory! But for all of the darkness, every cause has an effect.
40 students on the roof of Millbank.
Tienen mucha experiencia.
For all the talk of change, the present moment is really one of crisis.
A crisis of democratic representation.
Of identity.
A climate crisis.
Of a failing economic model which isn't working for most people.
We can't have a media that's beholden to advertisers or the political ambitions of oligarchs.
Which is why, in 2013, we founded Novara Media.
Unlike corporate media, we are funded by our subscribers.
There's no tax avoiders, there's no oil money, and there's no lords. What we're creating is media for you, which quite simply, you make possible.
We're looking to raise £40,000. That will allow us to not only keep on paying our contributors, but give them a little bit more, as well as keep our studio and take our fantastic Novara events nationwide.
To help us get there, go to support.novaramedia.com and give a one-off donation, or even better, sign up for a subscription.
We've already achieved so much, but the truth is, we've barely started.
The camera's on Tom. You're going to have to introduce yourself, Tom. The camera's on you.
I'm Tom Mills. Very happy to be joining Michael again on the fix. So welcome.
Hi, Joanna.
Me?
Yeah,
we meet
again.
Yeah,
the first time.
But I keep watching Tom speak.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the camera's, I don't know how the camera works, it's probably on a wide. This is Tom Mills, author of
Are you taking over now?
of Public Service. I'm going to ask you questions, aren't I? So, obviously, the big news is the BBC has released its pay scales. I didn't print anything out, but we've got some of our figures. So that was Chris Evans who puked at the end of that video, right?
Yep, so great appointment there.
He gets, I shouldn't be looking on as well, should I? He gets 2.2 million.
Yeah.
Gary Lineker's next with 1.75 million. I like Gary Lineker, to be
Funnier
honest.
than Chris Evans.
Yeah, Graham Norton with 850k. Should we be worried? Should we care?
Yeah, I think we should. Well, you know, I think, you know, there's a few things you need to put in context, right? I mean, so first of all, I was looking at the BBC accounts, and there's about like 21,000 people who work for the BBC, right? And this list they released is everybody who, executives and talent, so most of the media coverage is focused on, you know, the presenters and the sort of media figures, and then there's the executives and the people behind the scenes. But they all add up to, I think it was like 214 or something like that, people who are earning more than 150,000 other people on the list. So it just happens that they are literally the 1% of the BBC. As you've got 21,000 workers, you've got 214 people earning over 100,000. So yeah, so in terms of who these people are, if we think of the BBC as sort of a microcosm of British society, which I think in some ways it can be understood like that, this is the 1%, right? So should we be concerned about them? Yeah, first of all, they're earning a lot more than their colleagues. Secondly, they're the 1% in the sort of sense that they're also the movers and shakers and decision makers, right? So there are lots of people at the bottom of the pay scale who, you know, we can talk about as well, who don't have the power and authority that they have within the organisation. And I think the other thing is that, you know, what the BBC, the people at the top of the BBC are earning also reflects what the BBC's become. You know, as the BBC has become more commercialised, that's pushed up wages. So I think it is a political issue, and I think, as ever with the BBC, Liberals have sort of lined up in defence of the BBC, you know, and tweeting about all the great things that it does, you know, which is all, some of that's all well and good, I think. But I think just being defensive about it, I mean, first of all, I think transparency is a good thing, and secondly, I think it is a political issue. Just a question of, you know, how you handle it and putting it in context, I think.
Because, I mean, in one sense, this is a scandal which is being cynically used by the Murdoch press and by the Tory right to attack the BBC, because presumably their pay scales are just as off, probably just as... So the other controversies were that there's a massive gender pay gap, and also BAME people are considerably underrepresented in that top 100. But, I mean, Sky's probably just as bad. So how do we have a critical relationship to these figures without playing Murdoch's game?
Yeah. Well, that's always the problem with the BBC, isn't it? That, like, on the one hand, the right's attacking it, and on the other hand, you know, I think if we want to be constructive about the BBC, you know, we need to be, and this is what I've been arguing, you know, since since writing the book and doing the research, is that we need to have a critical understanding of the BBC, and we need to have an understanding of the BBC for all its flaws, and just pretending it's perfect and pretending that problems in British society in the last 30 years haven't impacted on the BBC. It's just absurd, I think. And if we keep being sort of, you know, completely defensive about the BBC, then I just don't think it's going to get us anywhere, really. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, the agenda is obviously coming from the right. I mean, it was the Conservatives who pushed us through, and then it gives them stories to the press, and, you know, this is the BBC being very wasteful, and of course, you know, at the same time, you've got to compare. So Tony Hall was like the highest paid executive. I can't remember exactly what his pay was. It was like something like 450,000 a year, which is obviously an enormous amount of money. But Mark Thompson was on like 650,000, something like that. So pay scales are much higher before. But also, like, FTSE 100 CEOs, you know, they get paid, I mean, literally 5.5 million. It's like the average they get paid. So that's, you know, that's 10 times what the Director General of the BBC gets paid. And this is an enormous organisation. So I think the way to handle it without sort of playing into the agenda of the right is just not being stupid, you know, and just understanding what's like going on, you know.
Tom Mills says, "Don't be stupid."
Yeah, that's the way forward, I think.
Yeah. So Joanna, Gary Lineker's defence was, he said, "Don't complain at me for getting 1.75 million. Blame competing channels for paying just as much, and blame my agent." Do you buy it?
No, I mean, like, I think something we haven't really mentioned here, although obviously this is what you mostly talk about, is the question that the BBC is a publicly owned, supposedly, mostly publicly owned, channel, and therefore, you know, like, we are paying for these people to get these enormous amounts of money. So to then just go and blame competition for not being as good, it sounds like a cop-out, or bad agents or whatever. I don't know.
Do you think the public-private thing's dangerous, though? Because, I mean, there's one argument, which is that private pay doesn't matter because that's their own business. The bank made it themselves. It's nothing to do with us. It's public pay where we need to know. It's the BBC where we need to know. We don't need to know Sky. We don't need to know the banks, but we do need to know the NHS. Do you think that gives the private sector an advantage, which...
No, I think we should know about everyone, to be honest, just so that we know what is parity and how do we, you know, somehow have a say on these things as citizens, active citizens. But particularly as a journalist, and if you look at a journalist and how much they earn there, which, you know, again, I'm thinking we should really, like, sort of try and put the setting standards higher, and so what we should all be seeing is lots more journalists making a lot more money rather than bringing these journalists down. I mean, you know, I'm not talking about Chris Evans. He's not a journalist.
We need loads and loads of journalists on 2.2 million.
Oh my goodness. But I mean, honestly, do think about how on a very, this is so bloody biased because I am a journalist, but if you thought of how many journalists 2.2 million can feed, sort of, you know those usual comparisons of like, this person is making so much money, imagine how many people it could feed. Like, imagine how many journalists this could feed, you know, in this stupid sort of analysis. But ultimately, it is how do we create creative media and in general a society in which wages don't have this crazy disparity, and how can we do it in a way that isn't playing to the right, as in slumping down all wages, but rather actually making sure that there is, you know, that FTSE 100 CEOs are not getting these ridiculously billionaire salaries.
I'm not going to jump to like Lineker's defence, but I mean, agents and intermediaries do play some role in this. So if you think of anyone who's in the job market, particularly as you get to like sort of middle class graduate jobs, you'll have these people who do like headhunting and stuff like that. And what they do is they mediate between different institutions, and then the more mobility you get between different institutions, the more it tends to inflate pay. So I think probably part of the reason why Robinson has a very high pay, apart from being a brilliant journalist, is that he's gone to ITV and then he's gone back to BBC. So I'd imagine when they did that, they had to offer him more then, and then you're at a certain pay scale. What happens here within companies is that often you have something in your contract that says, you can't talk to your colleagues about what you get paid. I mean, literally, it's within your contract, right? And the reason they do that is to stop people comparing and then trying to level out and collectively bargaining, essentially. So I think you know, one of the responses has been, okay, we shouldn't, you know, this is what happened. What's going to happen when we have transparency? This is what this guy called Steve Barnett was saying. He's a sort of a liberal apologist to the BBC, really. Was saying, if we have this transparency, this is going to push up wages because it means that everyone's going to see, well, actually, I think women should know in the workplace what all the men are earning, and people of colour should be knowing what all the white people are earning, and that way they can then approach their employees and say, well, this isn't actually fair. We should have transparency across the board, and that's why, you know, in the Equalities Act, you do have the right to ask for levels of parity for your other colleagues, right? Now, if we have more transparency within companies, then that can create better equality, I think, and parity of pay for people who are doing similar sorts of work, which should be a principle. And I agree about the private thing. I mean, okay, the whole notion of private sector is absurd. I mean, these PLCs are public, right, in the sense that we allow them to perform certain economic activities and to operate within a legal structure, which we as citizens sanction. So we need to get away from this sort of neoliberal notion that there's something there called the private sector and they should just get on with it. That's not the game anymore. These people, if they want to operate as with a certain economic structures, which we sanction through the banks, through the Bank of England, through a quasi-state infrastructure, need to play by our rules. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to say, we don't just need to know what the CEOs are being paid, we need to know your pay scales, and actually you have to be paying women as much as men performing the same job. There should be sanctions for people who don't do that, and the same I would say with all kinds of inequalities. So, yeah, I mean, I think a big challenge for left is to break down exactly what you're saying, you know, because obviously the bigger problems are in the private sector. Yeah. I mean, the BBC has a lot of flaws, but on some of these metrics, it's clearly better because there's more transparency in the private sector, and they're actually more regulated, and they have like some awful managerial stuff, but they have some fairly good stuff. I mean, the BBC is pretty poor on like ethnic diversity, but it's not nearly as bad as some other institutions.
Who's the worst?
Yeah, good question. Well, often we don't even know because we don't even have access to the figures, right?
Yeah,
but the BBC, I mean, so I looked into the figures on black and ethnic minority workers at the BBC, and they're sort of roughly parity with the UK. But the thing is, that's then skewed because it incorporates the World Service, which is international. So,
oh wow, it incorporates the World. Yeah, that would skew it, right?
So that obviously skews the figures, but also, if you look at things hierarchically, the higher up you go, the more white it gets. You know, as is often the case.
And male, I'm guessing, no?
Yeah, and male as well. Yeah. So, but they're not. There's a lot that needs to be done. They're probably not as bad as a lot of other institutions. I mean, I don't know enough about it, sort of name names really, but I'm thinking like the legal world, for example, is just a joke. I mean, when it comes to this.
Oh, in terms of differentials of pay.
No. In terms of like representation for the population.
Okay, right. I see.
So you think like we had the Social Mobility Commission when it went through all, you know, the powerful institutions in society. You know, did people go to public school? Like, you know, how diverse was it? I mean, it's kind of an embarrassment, really.
Okay, I mean, the interesting thing about the Gary Lineker argument is that it paints him as just a beneficiary of the system with no agency. So he's saying, well, I just get 1.8 million in my bank account. I can't change that. But I mean, you could. I mean, because you can he's said, I exist in a marketplace. The market does its job, and I'm just the casual beneficiary. Yeah. But I mean, he easily could, as a political statement. I mean, he's a guy with quite a lot of political clout now. Say, I don't need this 1.8 million pounds. I'm going to go for 70k, and all these white guys at the top of the BBC should also go down to 70k. Yeah. And I mean, that would be quite a politically powerful thing to do, right?
That'd be great if he did that. It would be great if he did it. But
Gary Lineker.
I mean, is it because...
Don't do a cop-out, all right?
Do you think it's because he was a footballer? I mean, this is something we need to think of, right? Because probably you could say the same about footballers. I mean, the only argument there is because they have a short span in terms of professional, you know, how long they can be active.
Yeah, I mean, there's no justification for earning that much money. I don't think you can say, well, the market just makes me this rich.
Well, I think basically what happens in this industry is that you have someone heading something, don't you? And they got recognition, and that means that as soon as they got recognition, you can get that through being, you know, an England footballer or presenting TGI Fridays or whatever. TFI, sorry. Yeah. And so that means that if you move, you can more or less take a big chunk of your audience with you, and then you get in your age. And I mean, second time I'm sticking up for Gary now. I agree with you, but I think the thing is, what happens is, to some extent, it is a result of commercialisation of a whole industry, you know. And you could say, actually, I don't need to be paid that much, but you'd be a sort of, I don't know, if we sort of fall back on that kind of moralism, then I mean, how many of us would honestly say, if someone said, you know, do you want X? You'd say, like, well, I don't need that money. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine because all of us need money.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah.
I guess I think. Isn't it like you get to like 40 grand and you don't need any more money? I think something like that.
For 40k.
Yeah, it might even be a lot less than that. But like they were saying, you get to a point where like you could almost do anything. You go out and eat restaurants. You can go abroad twice a year. And
I mean, the BBC's response, because I mean, I think it is clear why Gary Lineker gets that much money, because he's a good presenter and he would take an audience with him. Yeah. Like he's got a fair amount of charisma. He knows about sport.
Unlike
he knows
Chris
about
Evans.
football. Unlike Chris Evans. Well, I mean, Chris Evans obviously has. As I say, I didn't mind TFI Friday. I don't listen to his Radio 2 show, and I hate Top Gear. But BBC would argue that if they don't pay these extortionate figures, then that's going to make their big stars go to other channels. And then this is also seen as sort of like a right-wing plot, because you say, how is the BBC spending money on stuff that isn't just documentaries and public service? And then all the stars go. Then suddenly no one watches the BBC anymore, and that's the justification for cutting all this funding.
Can I add a controversial point here that maybe the audience will understand? I mean, how can it be that we're paying this much to Chris Evans and then the Great British Bake Off goes somewhere else? I mean, it baffles the mind.
But how do you... No, but it's not it's that you'd... If Gary Lineker goes to ITV, well, I mean, they'd have to buy the football as well. He didn't go to ITV when they bought the football, did he? Who did it then? I don't know. Anyway, people would go with Chris Evans.
I get that, but like I don't understand how these. And this is actually where I'm going to get quite like democracy for the BBC kind of. You correct me if I'm wrong here. Just as a viewer, I guess is where my opinion comes into. This is where public television then has a role, because we have no influence, no input on these decisions. Obviously, when the great GBO went off somewhere else, people created an outrage. But then the fact that Chris Evans, who is mostly a radio presenter now, gets this extraordinary amount of money, again, we have no say. But then we lose Mary... like, that's the sort of, like, these random feeling, at least to me, as someone who watches TV, and listens to the radio, quite random decisions.
Well, look, I think, just to add something to this, I mean, the whole...
Explain to me, Tom.
Well, the movement of the Bake Off thing... It's because the BBC commissions programming from private companies, so they're able to do it, right? And the BBC just had in-house programming. There'd be no issue of like the BBC does something everyone wants, and then they'd be like, oh, well, maybe we'll move it to Sky or whatever. That would never come up. And also, before the BBC became more commercialised, people didn't move backwards and forwards as much because the BBC was this sort of, jobs to life type thing that the Tories went after. So. Okay, so what's going on now at the BBC is Lord Hall, again without any democratic consent or discussion, and said we're going to fully commercialise all of BBC television. Every returning series is going to be open to competition, which basically means this is just going to happen all the time. So, like, what people are complaining about now, the BBC basically secretly agreed with Osborne and offered, say, we're going to commercialise everything. So what, we're going to see this all the time now. Where
so all the shows now are created by subcontracted external agency?
No, so 40% of BBC programming comes from the private sector, but 100% of BBC programming is now going to be in competition with the private sector. So basically it means, if you're in-house BBC and you make a programme, you almost sell it to the BBC, who then air it.
What about Newsnight?
It's like Uber, no? Like
some of them, some current affairs and news-related current affairs are exempt from this. But so, for example, Question Time is made by a private company, although on a different arrangement.
So could ITV buy Question Time?
No, because it's on a different arrangement, so it falls within current affairs.
Okay.
But the point is that if you're making these popular programmes, which is what we're talking about, they're the ones that make all the money, really. I mean, John Humphrys earns a fortune, but those programmes, even if you make them at the BBC, now, not only are you going to compete for that contract almost with some other provider, you're allowed to sell that programme to another provider. So you could take Great British Bake Off and say, actually, even though this is a BBC programme, we're going to sell it to Sky. We're going to sell it to Channel 4. Yeah, so... But actually the BBC will be doing that. So the BBC Studios, it's called, it's an arm's length commercial entity.
Oh, I see.
So people at the BBC are going to be selling out their own programmes to private. So this whole problem that we're facing, which is being discussed, as I said, in the most stupid fashion by the press, is being entrenched at the BBC deliberately. And nobody discusses this because when the whole charter renewal process was going on, they were obsessed with this idea about stars and the things we're supposed to be talking about now, like wages and all of that. Okay, fine. Behind that was this whole really radical commercialisation of the BBC's entire commissioning process. Never discussed. Even the people at The Guardian barely even mentioned it. It's never And it's like, oh right, okay, you know, we're privatising all of our public service television. That's fine. But this whole controversial issue of pay. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, which just isn't getting a look in on any discussions. And I think what we're seeing here is this kind of surface symptom of what's going on, which is basically the thing that the right like to talk about, which is like, look at these, you know, guys, and they're mostly guys with their massive pay packets, which we should be mad about as well. But you know,
all right, I think we're going to finish. You're both going to finish by telling me your favourite BBC show and the one thing the BBC has to change.
Oh goddamn. You know what? I'm going to say something really controversial in here. I listen to Today's Show every morning on BBC Radio 4. I still get enraged by its politics, but I have to say I've tried to listen to other things, but LBC makes me enraged and bored. So, in my personal opinion, so I just move back to
the Today Show. That's fine.
Know, Today Show. It's somehow, and there's I've lived here for so long now that I go abroad and I still have to listen to it in the morning. It's strange. Things happen when you live in Britain for too long. So that's it. What needs to change? Well, I definitely, personally, and having come from a country that did go through, actually our public television in Portugal went through a very similar process when Portugal hit austerity, you know, like after 2008. I mean, it was probably already being planned before. You know, you feel like you mourn the loss of public television somehow, be it ideologically or be it actually the practical loss of it. So what it needs to change is fully renationalize it. My humble opinion as a socialist, and obviously then invest. The state would have, you know, investment in it. We have a say in it and see high quality program it. But is this sort of
high quality nationalised programming?
A lot of news. Please bring me all the news.
More news.
All the
They've
news,
got a 24 news channel.
No, I know. I'm super subjective. It's super subjective.
Tom, favourite show? What are we demanding? One show, one demand.
I hate the Today programme, but if we were going like sort of highbrow current affairs, I guess.
No, you go for wherever you want.
I just love to do a drama. I really like Taboo with Tom Hardy. Did you watch that?
I've never. I actually think I should watch more TV.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. But if I was going to do journalism, I think the PM programme's better. It's like much less pompous. But it's not on in the morning, so obviously if you're working, it's not
I know it's a controversial opinion this week.
What needs to change? Oh God, so much. I mean, basically, I think it needs to be democratised. I mean, that needs to be the agenda, but how we do that and how we change it is going to be a very complex kind of process, which I'm going to be thinking about and writing about in the next year. So, you know, watch this space. I have a clever answer for you.
Fabulous.
Brilliant.
I'm not going to answer the question. That's the privilege I get. Well, I just couldn't think of any. I was trying to think of something funny. I was like, I kind of watch Newsnight sometimes, but I was like, that makes me sound like a 60-plus
radio?
person. The radio. I mean, I listen to the Today Show, but I often wake up very close to 9, and then it's just about to finish.
I'm amazed by the amount of people on the left who watch Question Time, Newsnight.
Yeah, well, I just see.
What about the proms? You know, like.
What do you mean? What about the proms?
I mean, it's like.
Obviously, you watch that.
I mean, in the sense of like, again, another like, you know, thing that is cultural, that is actually a brilliant way of actually a perfect example of democratization of classical music, you know, making it available to people who probably wouldn't be able to afford classical music as it usually is marketed. Sponsored mostly by the BBC.
Oh, maybe I could say not a show that I do watch, but a show I'm planning to watch, which is Ollie Alexander on being gay. Twitter's going wild for it. I can't recommend it because I haven't watched it, but that's the best I can do when it comes to the BBC.
Something you're going to watch.
Something I'm going to watch. Something I have watched is Newsnight, but I'm going to branch out. What I'd change... It's going to be on Sean This Way. It's going to be... Ollie Alexander is going to be on Sean This Way. I got that information afterwards, so it wasn't a cynical plug. What would I change? I'd say democratise the fucker. Let's have... I was at the media conference yesterday, and there was a BBC guy there, and I think what the BBC needs to change is that their political output is too much stuck in the tittle-tattle of Westminster, so there's so much public money is going into this thing, and I don't mean that as a moral thing, that we should hold it to higher standards than Sky, because, you know, I agree the distinction's kind of more useful for the right than the left. But I think the fact that we do have democratic control over it does mean that there is an opportunity to have an institution that pumps out genuinely useful content that tells us what's going on in the country. I think more sociologists should work for the BBC, and probably less people who knew politicians at Oxford, because it's just a sort of SW1. Blech. We could have better than that. Anyway, that's probably not a pitch that's going to get me some sort of consultancy job at the BBC. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Joanna.
My
We'll have you both back very soon. This was The Fix. We'll see you on Monday.